Let's move on to Australia. As you can see, the interior of the country is largely outback desert. Laying a direct normal radiation map over the continent shows strong solar resources over virtually all of it. Drawing an outline around that and adding in geothermal resources indicates that both are located in some of the same areas. This offers the opportunity to reduce costs dramatically by developing both resources simultaneously. Furthermore, the southern half of the country has strong wind and wave resources due to its proximity to the Great Southern Ocean. What's more, Australia's outback interior is, as these pictures show, flat and pretty charmless. This could make it ideal for large-scale generation of solar power. Indeed, the outback solar resource is so great that Australia's government science body, the CSIRO, has estimated that a concentrating solar power mirror field 32 kilometers on its side could satisfy all of Australia's electricity needs in 2020 when they are higher than they are now. By extrapolation, one can estimate a mirror field of this size, like the one just above Australia, could power China, the one above that the United States, the smaller one at left, world electricity demand, and the big one at left, hypothetical of course, world primary energy demand. One practical obstacle to doing this, though, is that Australia's present electricity grid doesn't go to the outback. The existing grid was built exclusively to service coastally located coal-fired power plants, but due to the looming turnover cycle of coal-fired power plants and the need to revamp and upgrade the grid at a time of rapidly advancing renewable technology, Australia has an opportunity, like elsewhere, to break with the past. With smart investment, it can reorient its future investment towards the high-potential energy sources of tomorrow with minimal worries about stranded assets. DESERTEC Australia, another organization I founded, has estimated the cost of new high-capacity grid infrastructure to carry large-scale solar, geothermal, and wind resources from Australia's outback to its coastal cities would be about $30 billion US. That's about 3% of current Australian GDP. While that seems like a big number, it matches rather closely the $27 billion Australia's Energy Supply Association says is needed in new grid infrastructure in the country over the next few years. It also compares favorably with the Australian government's plan for a $38 billion national broadband system. Okay, let's take a big conceptual leap. China has solar and wind. Australia has solar, wind, and geothermal. So let's just say, for argument's sake, Asia has two Saharas, one in Australia, one in China. The immediate problem, of course, is that they're at opposite ends of the hemisphere. Nonetheless, let's take another conceptual leap. Let's say we hook the two of them together using the same high-voltage direct current power lines that are proposed for Europe. Doing so could set the stage for large-scale exchange of solar and wind energy. Time differences between Australia and China could mean that afternoon Australian sun could power China's morning. Hemispheric seasonal differences could mean Australian summer sun could power Chinese winter heating. Let's just lay the European DESERTEC Industrial Initiative down on Asia and go from there. Satisfying 15% of Asia's electricity needs in 2050 would mean scaling up the European DESERTEC Initiative more than 4 times over, from 700 terawatt-hours per year to roughly 2,900 terawatt-hours per year. Then we would have to take into account the bigger distances in Asia. It's roughly 7,000 kilometers from Australia to China versus about 2,000 kilometers between North Africa and Northern Europe, a multiple of 3.5. The next thing to consider is whether to build the system by land or by sea, and if it's built on land, whether big transmission towers or buried cables should be used. All of these variations create numbers that are all over the place, but that shouldn't stop us. An Asian DESERTEC system satisfying 15% of 2050 Asian electricity needs would cost, on a very preliminary calculation, something like $2.2 trillion US. That's about 20% of current Asian GDP. It compares to roughly 3% of current European GDP for the European DESERTEC Industrial Initiative. That's a huge gap. But bear in mind, such huge infrastructure projects are not built overnight. They are built over 40 years. Furthermore, Asian GDP will be growing in coming decades much more quickly than European GDP. That makes a comparison to 2008 Asian GDP highly misleading. Nonetheless, it's a starting point. Without a doubt, a European DESERTEC-style plan for Asia would be hugely expensive, but then so would uncontrolled climate change. At this point, some other elements enter the mix. One is the anticipated development of new regional natural gas supplies. in Australia's offshore northwest shelf, the Timor Sea, and Australia's Queensland state, huge new conventional and unconventional natural gas resources are slated for development to serve the expanding energy markets of China, Japan, and South Korea. Present uncoordinated plans call for building as many as a dozen greenhouse gas-intensive, energy-hungry liquid natural gas compression plants around northern Australia and the Timor Sea, this at a collective cost of nearly $100 billion. Compressed LNG gas supplies would then be shipped in special pressurized tankers to dedicated Asian ports that would uncompress the gas for delivery to customers over traditional pipeline networks. But if a large capacity DESERTEC industrial initiative style high-voltage direct current power line infrastructure were laid connecting Australia to China, a natural gas pipeline system to the same locations could be built alongside. Given that labor costs account for roughly one-half of large energy infrastructure projects, including both simultaneously side by side would reduce the costs of both. It would also create a more flexible, reconfigurable, multipath network managed by common carrier economics and uniform technical standards. This would compare favorably with single-purpose, one-off infrastructure like LNG trains, pressurized tankers, regasification plants, and isolated national electricity markets. Given that we're already on the cusp of a major new energy investment cycle to replace fully depreciated current assets, we now have an opportunity to think different. This is one such way. Given time constraints, I won't go into much detail about this here. You can read a lot more about it on the DESERTEC-Asia website. At this point, I'll just say that template projects exist elsewhere upon which a deeper analysis of the technical challenges and cost estimates of a bundled natural gas high-voltage direct current power line infrastructure can be based. How might it all work? Let's start at the southern end. In Australia, solar and geothermal energy harvested from the outback could power the nation's coastal cities. The surplus would be bundled together into high-voltage direct current power lines and transmitted to Darwin in the Northern Territory. Natural gas pipelines laid alongside could deliver coal seam methane gas from Queensland. From Darwin, a bundled electricity cable, natural gas pipeline, would be built into the Timor Sea to just east of the Bayou Undan field. There it would meet a natural gas pipeline coming up from the Gorgon and Browsey fields in Australia's northwest shelf. From there, the bundled infrastructure would pass south of the island of Timor and then west of the Indonesian island of Flores. From there, it could go underwater through the South China Sea, or it could go by land across Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand en route to southern China. The build-out could be coordinated with existing plans by the ASEAN states to deepen the interconnection of their natural gas and electricity system. An example here is the Trans-ASEAN Pipeline Project. It's also in this region that such a project could generate many of its social gains. A Pan-Asian energy infrastructure passing through Indonesia could spur deeper electrification on the island of Java, where roughly 100 million people still live without electricity. Bringing those people power would enable them to participate in the global electronic economy. This would increase economic growth and improve standards of living. Among other things, this should reduce poverty-induced Indonesian deforestation. Given this, multilateral organizations like the Asian Development Bank might assist with funding. Such an infrastructure also would provide Indonesia an opportunity to more aggressively develop its geothermal reserves. These are estimated by Chevron Corporation at more than twice Indonesia's own electricity consumption, and they remain largely unexploited. A Pan-Asian energy infrastructure also would provide an opportunity for Borneo's Bakun Dam to provide load balancing power to a Southeast Asian grid dominated by renewables. In the greater Mekong states, the system could similarly go by land or by sea. If by sea, it could traverse the shallow South China Sea to the Chinese island of Hainan. There, a subsea natural gas field is already connected to Hong Kong over an 800-kilometer subsea gas pipeline. This provides an existing pathway. If over land, the transmission system could pass through Malaysia and Thailand and into China. There, it could connect to China's southwestern hydro assets. As this interconnection occurs, Chinese hydropower could be shifted to providing higher-value load balancing to a progressively interconnected regional grid dominated by renewables.